Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting in your living room, right?
Yeah.
You're just scrolling through your phone, or maybe you've got the evening news on in the background. And suddenly, the headline flashes that a major global superpower has just suffered, a total economic and military collapse.
It's out of nowhere.
Completely out of nowhere. And you barely even have time to process you're just sitting there in shock before the next headline breaks. Another nation, a historic ally has fallen.
Right.
And then another one and another. The actual borders on the map are just dissolving in real time.
Right.
Everything you thought was permanent, every massive institution you thought was just way too big to fail is suddenly turning to dust.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. And it culminates in the complete and utter collapse of the biggest, wealthiest, most impenetrable empire on the face of the earth.
Which sounds, like a dystopian movie pitch.
Exactly. It sounds like sci-fi. But that is exactly the reality we are looking at today. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the final chapters of the book of Jeremiah, specifically chapters 46 through 52.
Big finale.
Right, the grand finale. And we are going to explore the biblical text, and we'll be pulling from some really rich classic commentaries by folks like Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry to help us decode what's going on. But I want to be super clear right up front. Our mission here is not to just give you some dusty history lesson.
Please no.
Yeah, we are not just cataloging ancient battles here. Our goal is to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-life application hidden within these massive geopolitical shifts. We want to see how these ancient texts speak directly to you right now in the way you live, the way you build your life, and the illusions of security that we all tend to cling to.
And I think that's why this text is just so incredibly vital for us today. I mean, the historical context is our entry point, sure, but it's definitely not our final destination. Right. We are fundamentally looking at human nature here. We're looking at the arrogance of power and this underlying moral order of the universe, which honestly hasn't changed one fraction of a degree since these words were first written down.
It's wild how relevant it still is.
It really is. But to give you, the listener, a visual backdrop for this deep dive, you kind of have to picture the chaotic landscape of the ancient Near East in the 6th century BC.
Set the stage for us.
Okay, so if you were looking at a map of this era, you wouldn't see these nice, static, color-coded countries. You would see violently shifting borders. You'd see cities burning, ancient stone monuments literally crumbling into the dust.
Just total upheaval.
Total upheaval, because the Babylonian Empire, which is led by this infamous guy, King Nebuchadnezzar, is just sweeping across the known world.
Right.
And they aren't just, winning a few battles here and there. They are an unstoppable force of nature. They're like a tidal wave, just wiping away the entire old world order.
And right in the middle of all this chaos is the prophet Jeremiah.
Exactly. Sitting right in the rubble.
Yeah, he's essentially acting as this ancient war correspondent, right? And a spiritual diagnostician. He's documenting this domino-like fall of all the surrounding nations. Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Damascus, just one after another.
And then he does something crazy.
Right. He documents the staggering, almost unthinkable future fall of Babylon itself, which we will definitely get into. But okay. Let's unpack this from the beginning.
Let's do it.
Because we have to understand the sheer scale of this unstoppable force. Babylon is the new apex predator on the block. They are the hammer of the earth, as the text calls them.
Which is such a brutal, accurate nickname.
It really is. And the first major domino to fall in this geopolitical earthquake is Egypt. Now, chapter 46 opens with the Battle of Carchemish. And from what I understand, this isn't just a minor border skirmish.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
This is a clash of absolute titans right by the Euphrates River.
But help me understand the mechanics here. Because Egypt had been this massive, unshakable power for centuries. How does an empire with that kind of historical dominance and military infrastructure just collapse?
Well, to understand the magnitude of Carchemish, you really have to understand what Egypt represented at this time. I mean, Egypt was the old guard.
They were the establishment.
Exactly. They had centuries of wealth, tactical knowledge, institutional memory. So they marched north to the Euphrates River, led by Pharaoh Necho. And the Euphrates was basically the great dividing line between the Egyptian sphere of influence and the Mesopotamian world.
Okay, so they're defending their turf.
More than that, they're projecting their full imperial might. They didn't just send a small scouting party. The text in Jeremiah 46 is incredibly descriptive about this. It talks about them ordering their bucklers and shields, harnessing their war horses, polishing their spears until they gleamed.
Putting on the heavy coats of mail, yeah.
Right. The classic commentaries really highlight the sheer, overwhelming scale of these preparations. I mean, the Egyptians were leaving absolutely nothing to chance.
They pulled out all the stops.
They did. They brought in these vast mercenary forces from their allied territories. Heavily armed soldiers from Cush and Put, which were regions known for their fierce warriors, and highly mobile troops from Ludum.
So it's this massive multinational coalition.
Yes. If you looked at this army assembling by the river, they looked completely invincible.
But hold on, I need to challenge this narrative a bit because, well, you're describing an army that is fully equipped, highly trained, backed by mercenaries, and led by a pharaoh with endless resources.
Right.
And yet when they finally meet Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, it's not some prolonged 10-year siege. It is an absolute slaughter.
A total rout.
How does that actually happen on the ground? Do they just show up, look at the Babylonians, and suddenly forget centuries of military tactics? Like, what is the actual mechanism of this defeat?
That is a phenomenal question. And the text actually gives us the psychological mechanism behind it. Because it wasn't that they lacked weapons, They lacked an enduring foundation when they were faced with a totally new paradigm of warfare. See, the Babylonian war machine under Nebuchadnezzar was fundamentally different. It was relentlessly disciplined, heavy infantry, and they used tactics that completely overwhelmed Egypt's traditional and probably outdated reliance on chariots and disjointed mercenary groups.
So they were basically fighting the last war.
Exactly.
Yep.
But Jeremiah doesn't even focus on the military tactics. He focuses on the psychological collapse.
Right, the terror.
Yeah, the text says that this mighty Egyptian army is suddenly dismayed. They turn backward, their mighty warriors are beaten down, and they flee in such desperate haste that they don't even look back.
Yeah.
The phrase used is terror is on every side.
Wow.
And what the classic historical observers like Henry and Barnes point out here is this profound contrast between humanity's immense, arrogant preparation and the sudden reality of divine judgment.
Like all that polishing of spears didn't matter.
Not at all. The Egyptians meant one thing. They wanted to advance their own dignity, expand their borders.
Right.
But the underlying moral order meant another. The day didn't belong to Pharaoh Necho.
It belonged to the Lord of Armies.
Exactly. It was a day of reckoning. And when that psychological terror hits, when the command structure just completely breaks down, all the hired mercenaries in the world cannot stop a rout.
It's striking how visceral, how deeply human the reactions are in these texts. I mean, we aren't just reading a ledger of who won and who lost.
Oh, it's very raw.
We are reading the psychological unspooling of entire societies. And if we move slightly forward to chapter 47, the camera shifts over to the Philistines, and the description here is genuinely chilling.
It is. It's awful.
The sources describe the sensory approach of the Babylonian army, the stamping of the horses' hooves, the rushing of the chariots, the deafening rumbling of the wheels.
Just the sheer noise of it.
The noise alone and the resulting panic among the Philistines is so intense, so completely overwhelming that fathers are fleeing the cities and they don't even look back to check on their own children.
Yeah.
Because as the text says, their hands are so feeble. I mean, let's just sit with that for a second. That is a terrifying portrait of total societal collapse.
It really requires us to pause
Ah.
because we have this tendency to, distance ourselves from ancient history. We read it as a sterile list of dates and troop movements.
Just names on a page.
Exactly. But Jeremiah refuses to let us look away from the human cost. That specific image of fathers being so paralyzed by fear that their hands literally drop to their sides, rendering them incapable of even turning their heads to ensure the survival of their own kids, it highlights the absolute terrifying fragility of the societies we build.
Because the biological imperative to protect your young is like the strongest force in human nature.
Right. For that to break down means the societal structure hasn't just cracked, it has disintegrated at a molecular level.
And the Philistines had relied on their alliances, right?
Heavily. They specifically looked to the wealthy coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon to save them. But the prophecy declares that the sword has come to cut off from Tyre and Sidon every helper that remaineth. Their alliances were paper-thin against this reality.
When we picture ancient history, I think we usually imagine it moving at a glacial pace.
Sure, slow marches across the desert.
Yeah, sieges that last for 5 or 10 years. But reading this text, reading about the rhythmic stamping of hooves and the immediate collapse of these nations, it feels incredibly fast.
It's a blitzkrieg.
It really is. It feels modern. If I can put it in today's terms, it feels less like a medieval siege and more like a brutal corporate hostile takeover, but, executed with chariots and iron.
I like that analogy.
You have these nations, Egypt, Philistia, who were entirely confident in their wealth, their historical borders, their dominance, and then practically overnight they're just swept away. But that speed brings up a vital theme here. How did these nations react to this sudden, sweeping vulnerability?
Well, they reacted with sheer disbelief, followed immediately by the kind of panic that dissolves families, as we just saw. And this brings us directly to the central philosophical theme that really binds this entire section of Jeremiah together.
Which is?
The profound illusion of earthly security.
Yes.
These nations were operating under a fundamental delusion. They relied on physical geography, they relied on accumulated wealth, and they relied on these incredibly complex political alliances.
They thought they were untouchable.
They thought they had engineered a fail-safe society. But the insight Jeremiah extracts from all this wreckage is a harsh, uncompromising reality. When the appointed time arrives, when the moral scales of the universe finally tip and accountability is demanded, all human defenses fail completely.
Wow.
The speed of the collapse isn't just a military anomaly, it is a theological statement. It's meant to show that when the foundation of a nation or even a personal life is rotten, when it's built on hubris and exploitation rather than truth and justice, it doesn't take a century for the house to fall, it takes a single overwhelming storm.
That transition leads us perfectly into examining the specific, varied illusions of security these different nations held onto. Because they weren't all making the exact same mistake, were they?
No, they each had their own unique brand of arrogance.
Exactly. So let's start by looking back at Egypt's false confidence. Jeremiah uses an incredible, highly specific metaphor in chapter 46. He compares Egypt's arrogance to the flooding of the Nile River.
Which is brilliant.
Right. Egypt is depicted rising up like the mighty Nile, its waters surging and churning, and they're boasting, "I will rise up, I will cover the earth, I will destroy cities."
It is the perfect cultural and geographical metaphor. I mean, for millennia, the Nile was the absolute center of Egypt's existence. It was their life source, their agricultural wealth, their immense power.
Without the Nile, there is no Egypt.
Exactly. Its annual, predictable flood brought fertile silt to the land, ensuring their survival. And because their entire reality was shaped by this massive, life-giving river, Egypt began to see itself as an unstoppable natural force.
Like we are the flood.
Yes. They believed they could simply overflow their borders and drown their enemies, just as the Nile overflows its banks. But the text shows God essentially mocking this deeply ingrained arrogance.
Oh, definitely.
Despite all their polished spears, their harnessed horses, and their expensive mercenaries, their defeat is absolute. Matthew Henry, drawing on the broader wisdom traditions, points out the enduring truth here. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong.
Right.
Egypt possessed the swiftest horses and the strongest mercenaries, but in the face of moral judgment, it amounted to absolutely nothing.
It's almost tragically ironic. The prophet even tells Egypt, in this tone of biting sarcasm, to go up into Gilead and get balm.
Yes, the healing balm.
Right, balm being this famous ancient medicine. He says, "You use many medicines in vain. There is no healing for you. The wound to their national pride, to their structural integrity is fatal. No amount of historical remedies can patch that breach."
It's a terminal diagnosis.
It really is. But we have to contrast Egypt with our next nation. Because what happens when a nation's rot doesn't come from relying on external military might, but from internal stagnation.
That brings us to Moab.
Yes, Moab. And Moab's illusion of security is completely different from Egypt's. The metaphor used to describe it in chapter 48 is, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant and psychologically penetrating insights in the entire text.
I agree completely.
Jeremiah says Moab has been at ease from his youth and has settled on his dregs, and crucially, has not been emptied from vessel to vessel.
Yeah, this is a masterful, highly specific agricultural metaphor that we really need to carefully decode for a modern audience, because most of us aren't ancient winemakers.
Right, please explain this to us.
So Albert Barnes explains this ancient winemaking process beautifully, and understanding it is key to understanding Moab psychology. In the ancient Near East, when good wine was fermented, it was left to stand on its sediment.
Which are the dregs.
Exactly, the dregs or the lees. And initially, this process was beneficial. Sitting on the dregs was thought to make the wine stronger, to give it a richer color and a more robust flavor.
Oh, nice. Sounds good so far.
However, there was a catch. If the wine was left way too long on those dregs and never filtered, if it was never actively poured from one vessel into another vessel to separate the pure wine from the sediment, it would eventually spoil.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it would become vapid, overly sweet, thick, and essentially ruined for consumption.
That is a fascinating chemical process. But how does the mechanism of unpoured wine translate into the geopolitical and psychological state of a nation?
We have to look at Moab's unique history. See, Moab, unlike Israel or even some of the coastal nations, had rarely been conquered. They hadn't been repeatedly invaded or sent into brutal captivity.
You were kind of isolated.
Yeah, they occupied a relatively secure, elevated plateau. So they had lived in relative peace, stability, and agricultural prosperity for generations. In other words, they hadn't faced the disruptive, painful, existential trials that force a nation to adapt.
To innovate.
Exactly, to build true resilience. Because Moab was never emptied from vessel to vessel, because they never experienced the violent upheaval of captivity or severe struggle, they became incredibly arrogant.
And complacent.
Yes, their national character stagnated. Just like the wine left too long on the sediment, their societal flavor went bad. They looked completely intact from the outside, but structurally, they were incredibly weak.
I want to upgrade the analogy here because we often hear this compared to like a trust fund kid, right?
Sure, the kid who has everything handed to them.
Yeah, someone who crumbles at the first sign of real hardship, or maybe a company that has had a monopoly for too long and forgot how to compete. But I think it goes much deeper than that.
How so?
It's not just a behavioral flaw. It is a biological and systemic vulnerability. Think about an apex predator that has evolved in a perfectly controlled ecosystem where it has absolutely zero competition.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Or think about a highly specialized organism raised inside a sterile, climate-controlled biodome. It looks incredibly healthy, perhaps even dominant within its specific parameters, but it has developed zero immune system.
Right, no adaptive resilience.
Exactly. The moment the climate changes by a single degree or the moment a new pathogen is introduced, the organism doesn't just get sick, it dies immediately. Moab had absolutely no geopolitical immune system. They had never been exposed to the stressors that build societal antibodies.
That is an exceptionally precise way to frame it. The lack of evolutionary stress was their fatal flaw. Moab's ease was the very mechanism of their undoing.
Wow.
They boasted in their wealth, their secure borders, their past achievements. They explicitly said, "We are mighty men and valiant men for the war." But that was just untested bravado.
It was theoretical.
Completely theoretical. When the heavy infantry of the Babylonian army finally arrived on their doorstep, all that untested confidence evaporated instantly. The text says Moab will be shattered like a vessel in which no one delights. It is a profound psychological warning about the hidden dangers of an untested, overly comfortable existence. Struggle, disruption, hardship, the painful process of being poured from vessel to vessel are very often the exact mechanisms that refine us, filter out our impurities, and forge lasting strength.
That is such a crucial insight. But we need to move to the next layer of arrogance, which brings us to Edom in chapter 49.
Edom.
Yeah, if Egypt was arrogant about its military might and Moab was arrogant about its comfortable wealth, Edom's arrogance was literal, geographical, and intellectual arrogance.
That was a very different flavor of pride.
Definitely. Edom lived in the clefts of the rock. And for those trying to picture this, we are talking about the region encompassing the ancient, astonishing city of Petra.
The Rose-Red City.
Yes, these were incredible, impenetrable cities carved directly into sheer cliff faces. They were accessible only by this narrow, winding canyon called a sick, which could be defended by like a handful of men against an entire army.
It was essentially a natural fortress.
Right. They literally lived high up in the rocks looking down on the world, and they thought, who can bring me down to the ground? Furthermore, they didn't just boast in their rock, they boasted in their brains.
Yeah, their famous intellect.
They were famous for their intellectual elite. The wise men of Taman were renowned throughout the ancient Near East as master philosophers and strategists.
What's fascinating here is how the text addresses this specific combination of geographical and intellectual hubris. Edom thought their fortress was impregnable. They thought their physical isolation guaranteed their survival.
But God bypasses all of that.
Completely bypasses it. The prophecy pierces right through that illusion. God says, though you should make your nest as high as the eagle, I will bring you down from there.
I love that imagery.
And what is truly fascinating is the method of their destruction. The text explicitly states that God doesn't even need to send a massive, overwhelming elite force to dislodge them. It uses a deeply humiliating image.
Oh, the least of the flock line.
Yes. It says God will cause them to run away in terror, and the least of the flock will drag them out.
The least of the flock. That is such a devastating, humbling phrase. It basically implies that the most insignificant, untrained foot soldier of the invading army will be enough to undo them.
Precisely. The commentators note the profound theological irony here. If the moral order of the universe decrees the fall of a proud nation, it doesn't require a fierce lion to accomplish the task.
Right. A lamb could do it.
The weakest, lowest, most insignificant member of the opposition will be more than sufficient to drag the proud, elite Edomites out of their impenetrable rock fortresses.
Their security was a total illusion.
A complete illusion. The very cliff that kept their enemies out also served as an echo chamber, trapping them in their own arrogance. And their intellectual security, the famous wisdom they prized so highly, completely vanished when confronted with actual chaos.
Because theory doesn't hold up in a crisis.
Exactly. The text asks rhetorically, is wisdom no more in Teman? Has counsel perished from the prudent? When the crisis finally breached their walls, all their philosophers, all their elite strategists were utterly confused and paralyzed. Their intellect could not save them from the consequences of their pride.
So let's bring this into a modern translation. Let's frame this as a psychological reflection for you, the person listening right now.
How does this challenge us today?
Right, because we obviously don't live in a carved rock fortress in Petra.
No.
But the human impulse to build impregnable walls hasn't changed at all. We've just changed the building material.
Absolutely.
We build financial fortresses, relying on a robust, diversified stock portfolio, assuming the market will always serve as our ultimate protector against the chaos of the world.
Or we rely on our careers.
Yes, the prestige of a secure, elite job title. Or perhaps most dangerously, we rely on the sheer power of our own intellect, our degrees, and our education, assuming that we are just like the wise men of Teman.
We think we're too smart to fail.
Exactly. Too clever to be caught in the collapse. But Jeremiah's psychological blueprint is forcing us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Anything you place on a pedestal above foundational moral truth, any identity you build that ignores justice and humility, is House of Cards.
It will eventually fall.
It has to. If your ultimate core security is anchored entirely in your bank account, the bullet points on your resume, or the physical safety of your gated community, you are living in a dangerous illusion.
Because historical and personal disruption will inevitably come.
It always does. And if you haven't built your life on something deeper, on integrity, on adaptable resilience, on moral truth, those walls will crumble and all your accumulated wisdom will vanish in the crisis.
And as we talk about disruption and the crumbling of these walls, it inevitably leads us to a massive, imposing obstacle in this text.
Yeah, we can't ignore this part.
No, we have to address this head on, because it is the elephant in the room for any modern reader engaging with the book of Jeremiah. As we read through these detailed judgments against Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, and Edom, the language used is shockingly, overwhelmingly brutal.
I have a massive problem with this, and I know a lot of listeners will too. It is a severe obstacle to growth.
It makes people want to put the book down.
Exactly. You open this ancient text hoping for, spiritual guidance, and you read commands like slay all her bullocks, which is a thinly veiled metaphor for the wholesale slaughter of the nation's young men and wealthy nobles.
Right.
You read descriptions of the sword devouring human flesh until it is literally satiated and drunk with blood. You read prophecies about vibrant, bustling cities being utterly reduced to scorched deserts inhabited only by jackals and ostriches.
This horrific imagery.
It is. As a modern reader, my immediate reaction is to just close the book. I have to ask, and I really want to push you on this, why shouldn't a modern listener just dismiss this entirely?
I get that.
How is this not just the ancient tribal propaganda of a barbaric era trying to retroactively justify the slaughter of their political enemies? How on earth do we grapple with this terrifying concept of the sword of the Lord?
Look, it is the most vital question we can ask of this text. And it requires us to read with profound critical discernment. We cannot sanitize it, but we must understand it.
Yeah.
First, we have to acknowledge the grim historical reality of the era. The language Jeremiah uses reflects the brutally violent, unforgiving warfare of the ancient Near East. That was the established vocabulary of power in the 6th century BC.
It was how they talked about conquering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a prophet was going to speak about geopolitical consequences, he had to use the geopolitical language of the day. But And this is the crucial distinction. We have to look past the cultural vocabulary to grasp the underlying theological and philosophical point.
Which is what?
The point is not the celebration of violence. The point is ultimate accountability. Here is the cognitive dissonance for the modern reader. We often want a universe governed by a God of infinite love, but we deeply resist the concept of a God of wrath or severe justice.
Right.
Yet philosophically, the two are completely inseparable.
I agree with that premise. I mean, if there is no mechanism for justice, then love has no teeth when it is forced to confront actual systemic evil.
Yeah.
Love without justice is just sentimentality.
Exactly. The classic analysts of this text, like Henry, provide a very nuanced approach to this violence. They employ a concept that we can summarize as every bullet has its charge. Or in the ancient context, every sword swing has its charge.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that even the horrific, chaotic, seemingly random violence of war is ultimately subordinate to a higher sovereign moral order. God is not depicted in these texts as a bloodthirsty deity delighting in the carnage.
Okay.
Rather, the text asserts that the divine order utilizes the existing, flawed geopolitical forces of the day to enact a cosmic balance. We must remember who is being judged here.
The oppressive empires.
Yes. These nations, Egypt, Moab, Edom, and yes, Babylon included, were themselves incredibly violent, oppressive, and tyrannical empires. They had built their staggering wealth and impregnable fortresses on the broken backs of the vulnerable through slave labor, conquest, and cruelty.
So the punishment fits the crime.
The brutal language of judgment is a reflection of the brutal reality they themselves created.
But that explanation brings up a massive contradiction that I still struggle with. We are talking about the role of Babylon. Throughout these chapters, Babylon is explicitly described as God's battle axe and a golden cup in the Lord's hand.
Right. They are the instrument.
The text claims God is using Babylon as the instrument to discipline these other nations and bring down their arrogance. But Babylon is committing atrocities. How can a supposedly just cosmic order utilize a ruthless, bloodthirsty empire to do its dirty work? Isn't that a fatal flaw in the theology?
It would be a fatal flaw if the story ended there, but it doesn't. And that is the crucial, brilliant turning point in the entire theology of Jeremiah.
Oh, yeah, unpack that.
Babylon might be the temporary instrument of geopolitical consequence, but Babylon is absolutely not exempt from the moral law. The moral standard is terrifyingly universal.
So they get theirs too.
Exactly. Because Babylon acted with wanton cruelty, because they operated with immense suffocating pride, and because they showed a total lack of mercy, specifically in how violently they treated the exiles of Judah, they too will be held to the exact same standard.
Wow.
They too will be forced to drink from the cup of wrath they forced down the throats of others. The universe Jeremiah describes is one where you reap exactly what you sow. Babylon will be shattered just as utterly as they shattered others. They are a tool, yes, but a tool that will eventually be broken because of its own inherent corruption.
That reframes it entirely. If we connect this philosophical debate to the listener today, we have to recognize our own deep internal contradictions.
How so?
Well, we might read the book of Jeremiah and instinctively recoil from the harsh, bloody language of judgment, finding it archaic and, offensive to our modern sensibilities. But at the exact same time, we inherently, desperately crave justice. When we turn on the news and see powerful oligarchs, corrupt multinational corporations, or tyrannical regimes abusing the vulnerable, when we see them hoarding immense wealth while children starve, or committing blatant atrocities without consequence, something incredibly deep inside the human spirit screams for accountability.
Yes. We want the bad guys to pay.
We do. We want the oppressor to be stopped. We want the scales to be balanced. We demand that evil does not get a free pass.
And it is a fundamental human hunger. And this text, as deeply uncomfortable and jarring as it is to read, is a profound, unflinching assertion that ultimate justice actually exists.
It's not just chaos.
Exactly. It asserts that human history is not just a chaotic, meaningless play of power, where the strong always devour the weak and get away with it forever. It claims that there is a sovereign moral center. He sees the systemic oppression, he records the arrogance, and he will act. The sword of the Lord is a terrifying, violent metaphor, but at its core, it represents the enduring promise that evil, oppression, and human hubris will not have the final word in the story of humanity.
And that brings us to the climax of the story. Here's where it gets really interesting. because the narrative shifts gears and becomes incredibly dramatic.
The focus changes completely.
We've spent all this time detailing how these smaller historic nations fell to Babylon. But now, as we enter chapters 50 and 51, the camera pans away from the conquered and focuses squarely on the ultimate empire itself. We get the prophecy of the fall of Babylon.
The big one.
And we have to set the context here, because at this specific moment in history, predicting the fall of Babylon would have sounded like absolute lunacy. Babylon didn't just seem powerful, it seemed eternal. It was the undisputed center of the world.
It is almost impossible to overstate the massive, intimidating scale of Babylon to an ancient observer. We have records from ancient historians like Herodotus, and the classic commentaries compile these details to give us the picture.
Paint that picture for us.
The broad outer walls of Babylon were said to be 85 feet thick.
85 feet thick.
Let that sink in. They were so incredibly wide that multiple chariots could race side by side on top of them.
That is absurd.
It was a city of unimaginable wealth, essentially a repository for all the treasures plundered from every conquered nation across the globe. It was heavily fortified not just by walls, but by the mighty Euphrates River itself.
Right, the river ran right through it.
Exactly, which was engineered to flow directly through the center of the city, providing an endless water supply that made a siege seem mathematically impossible. It was the New York, London, and Rome of its day, all rolled into one colossal, intimidating metropolis.
It was the literal ancient definition of too big to fail. If you lived then, you just couldn't conceive of a world without Babylon.
Precisely. And yet, there's Jeremiah. He is sitting hundreds of miles away in the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem, a city Babylon just destroyed. And from the ashes, he prophesies Babylon's total, unequivocal doom.
It takes so much audacity to do that.
It does. He declares that an enemy from the north, which historical hindsight tells us points to the rising coalition of the Medes and Persians, will come and lay this invincible city to waste. The text says the golden cup that intoxicated the whole earth is going to be suddenly shattered.
And the way this specific prophecy is delivered is nothing short of cinematic. It's not just a spoken word. Jeremiah orchestrates this incredible piece of prophetic theater, which is detailed in chapter 51.
The story with the scroll.
Yes. Jeremiah meticulously writes down the entire decree of Babylon's doom on a single scroll. He then summons a man named Seraiah. Now, Seraiah isn't a nobody. He is the quartermaster.
He's a high-ranking official.
Right. He's traveling on a diplomatic mission to Babylon with the defeated king Zedekiah. Jeremiah hands this scroll of doom to Seraiah and gives him highly specific, almost dangerous instructions. He tells him, when you arrive in Babylon, you must read all these words aloud. Then you must tie a heavy stone to the scroll and throw it into the very middle of the Euphrates River.
Such a powerful image.
And as you watch it sink beneath the water, you must declare, thus shall Babylon sink and will not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her.
You have to stop and think about the profound psychological weight of that action. Seraiah is standing in the very heart of the greatest, most technologically advanced, most militarily powerful city on the face of the earth.
Surrounded by all that grandeur.
He is completely surrounded by towering monuments of apparent invincibility. The massive ziggurats, the hanging gardens, the Ishtar Gate. And in the shadow of all that human glory, he quietly drops a rock-weighted piece of parchment into the river, declaring that the entire empire is already dead.
It gives me chills.
It is the ultimate, defiant statement of the transience of human power. The river that gives Babylon its life and security is now holding the decree of its death.
If we step back and connect this specific ritual to the broader human condition, it says something incredibly profound about how empires operate.
They all have a blind spot.
Exactly. Every single empire, every superpower in human history suffers from the delusion that it is the end of history. They all believe they have finally solved the equation of eternal dominance. They think they have outsmarted the cycle of collapse.
Yes, and the commentators point out the tragic, repeating irony of this hubris. Babylon went from being described as the head of gold to being prophesied as a burnt mountain.
That's quite a downgrade.
It is. The nations of the earth drank the wine from Babylon's golden cup, and, as the text says, they went mad.
What does that mean, practically?
It means they were completely intoxicated by the allure of Babylon's power, its wealth, its apparent stability. They wanted to emulate it. They wanted to ally with it. But it was a hypnotic illusion. The decree stated that Babylon would become a desolation, a dry land, a place where no human being dwells.
And history proved him right.
The historical record eventually bears this out perfectly. Babylon did fall. Its impenetrable river was ingeniously diverted by Cyrus the Great. Its massive walls were breached from underneath. And today, the once great center of the world is literally nothing more than an archaeological ruin in the desert.
But intertwined with the sweeping prophecy of geopolitical doom is a highly urgent, highly specific command directed at the people of God who are currently living as exiles inside Babylon.
This is where it gets very practical.
Right. The text doesn't just say, hey, watch Babylon fall. It repeatedly and desperately cries out, flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity.
Get out now.
And in another striking verse, it commands, go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans and be as the male goats before the flocks. Now, the Chaldeans were the ruling class of Babylon, so it's saying get out of Babylonian territory immediately. And the metaphor of the male goats means don't wait for the crowd. Be the leaders in getting out.
This is where the text crosses over from theological observation to demanding immediate radical action from the reader. We have to remember the context of the Israelites here.
They had been there for a while.
They had been in Babylon for years. They had built lives there. They had constructed houses, planted gardens, started businesses, grown comfortable.
They integrated.
Exactly.
Right.
Babylon, despite being their captor, offered immense wealth, security, and cosmopolitan luxury. But Jeremiah's warning shatters that comfort. He is telling them that the entire systemic structure of Babylon is under divine judgment and is fundamentally rotting from the inside out.
It's a sinking ship.
It is going to collapse. And the brutal reality is, if they stay attached to the system, if they continue to draw their security and identity from it, they will go down with the ship. They must proactively detach themselves from the toxic system before the judgment falls.
So let's make this highly practical for you, the listener. This is where ancient history becomes a psychological mirror. What is your Babylon?
That's the real question.
Obviously, you and I aren't living as exiles in the 6th century BC Chaldean Empire, but we all exist within modern systems that are incredibly intoxicating, deeply comfortable, but ultimately corrupt, exploitative, or entirely out of alignment with our core moral truth.
Exactly. Your Babylon could be a toxic corporate culture that systematically rewards ruthlessness, dishonesty, and the exploitation of subordinates.
And you've just been staying quiet?
Participating in the culture simply because the salary and the stock options are just too good to walk away from. Or it could be a specific social circle or an elite network that is completely consumed by vapid materialism and the relentless pursuit of status.
And you can feel it slowly eroding your actual values.
Yes. Or, in today's climate, it could be a rabid political ideology that demands your absolute blind loyalty while requiring you to harbor deep hatred and contempt for the other.
Right. Babylon is any system, any relationship, or any institution that asks you to trade your foundational moral pace for its specific delicacies.
It's a psychological blueprint for survival.
You cannot heal a corrupt system from within while you are simultaneously partaking in its rewards and being intoxicated by its wine. So the actionable reflection here, the challenge, is to critically identify that one specific area in your life where you are entirely too comfortable residing in Babylon. Where are you drinking the wine and slowly going mad?
That's a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is. And the demanding challenge from Jeremiah is to flee.
Yeah.
Now, let's be clear about what that actually means. It might mean literally handing in your resignation and quitting that toxic job, even if it means a terrifying loss of income.
Which is incredibly scary.
It might mean setting hard, unbreakable boundaries with that toxic social circle. It might mean walking away from a highly lucrative but fundamentally unethical business deal. You have to be the male goat before the flock.
You can't wait for permission.
You cannot wait for a consensus. You have to take the lead, make the incredibly hard choice, and detach yourself before the system collapses and drags your soul down with it.
We shouldn't understate how difficult that is. It requires immense countercultural courage to willingly walk away from a system that appears to be successful, thriving, and powerful, especially when everyone around you is telling you that you're absolutely crazy to leave.
Everyone will think you're nuts.
The gravitational pull of Babylon is enormous. But the enduring wisdom of this text is that true, lasting security is never found in the golden cup of a corrupt empire. It is only found in alignment with the truth.
As we move into the final sections of our deep dive today, the tone of the text makes a massive, unexpected shift.
It really does.
We pivot from this relentless drumbeat of judgment, fire, and collapse to a profound, quiet sense of hope and restoration. Because woven intricately through all this destruction, there is a surprising, incredibly beautiful thread of grace.
And this shift forces us to ask a vital philosophical question. What is the ultimate driving purpose behind all this divine upheaval?
It's not just anger.
No. The text makes it clear that it is not just destruction for the sake of destruction. The universe is not a slaughterhouse. The classic commentaries point out a very easily overlooked yet completely stunning detail embedded in these prophecies.
I love this part.
Even amidst the most terrifying, absolute declarations of doom for Israel's historic bitter enemies, God inserts specific promises of future restoration. The text explicitly promises to reverse the captivity of Moab, Ammon, and Edom in the latter days.
I have to admit, when I first read that, it took my breath away. It is so utterly unexpected. After dedicating entire chapters to describing the meticulous destruction of these nations, the text suddenly promises their restoration.
It's shocking, Grace.
And the verse directed at Edom, the proud, arrogant nation living in the cliffs, is perhaps the most emotionally moving verse in the entire section. While the nation is collapsing, God speaks directly to the collateral damage of the war.
The most vulnerable.
God says, "Leave your fatherless children. I will preserve them alive. Let your widows trust in me." Think about the sheer compassion of that statement. Even while actively dismantling the proud, oppressive machinery of the Edomite Empire, the divine heart is immediately moved by the most vulnerable victims, the widows and the orphans left behind in the rubble.
It's beautiful.
Even in the absolute epicenter of severe judgment, there is profound, staggering mercy.
It is a theological masterstroke.
Yeah.
It definitively shows that the ultimate desire of the moral order is not annihilation, but redemption. Justice clears the rot so that new life can grow.
That's perfectly stated.
And this restorative purpose is most vividly, most beautifully seen in the promise made to the exiled people of Israel. Chapter 50 describes the turning of the geopolitical and spiritual tide. Babylon is falling, but the exiles are going home.
The Great Return.
The text paints this poignant, deeply emotional picture. The exiles are described as returning, but they aren't marching back as arrogant conquerors. They are described as going weeping, shedding tears of joy, relief, and profound repentance.
They're broken but healed.
They are asking the way to Zion with their faces steadfastly turned toward it, saying to one another, "Come, and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten."
For those who might not know, explain the significance of Zion in this context. It's not just a geographic location on a map, is it?
No, Zion is much more than a hill in Jerusalem. In the biblical imagination, Zion represents the theological heart of God's presence. It is the locus of the covenant, the place where heaven and earth intersect and where truth and justice reign.
So it's the ultimate reality.
So when the exiles were asking the way to Zion, they aren't just asking for geographic directions. They're asking for the path back to spiritual reality.
It's a beautiful image of a broken people who had lost absolutely everything. I mean, they lost their city, their majestic temple, their sovereignty, and their freedom.
Everything they built their identity on.
But in losing everything, they finally woke up from the nightmare. They have been brutally stripped of all their illusions of security. And now, standing in the ruins of the empire that enslaved them, they don't want wealth or power anymore.
No, they've seen where that leads.
Exactly. They just want the truth. They want Zion.
And that profound yearning brings us to the very end of the book, chapter 52. Now, structurally, this final chapter is largely a historical appendix. It essentially repeats and confirms the tragic historical details of the fall of Jerusalem.
It's a dark chapter.
We are forced to look one last time at the horrific end of King Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the king who stubbornly rebelled against Babylon, who ignored every single one of Jeremiah's desperate warnings, and who foolishly tried to flee in the middle of the night when the city walls were breached.
He just wouldn't listen.
He is captured by the Babylonians. In an act of unspeakable cruelty, his sons are slaughtered right in front of his eyes. Then he is immediately blinded, bound in heavy bronze fetters, and dragged off to a dark prison in Babylon.
So the last thing he ever saw was the consequence of his own arrogance.
Exactly. It is a stark, brutal, unforgiving reminder of the harsh consequences of stubbornly ignoring the truth and rebelling against reality. Zedekiah's story is the ultimate tragedy of pride.
But, and this is what makes the architecture of this book so incredible, the book of Jeremiah does not end there. It refuses to let the final note be the darkness of Zedekiah's blindness and imprisonment.
There's one more scene.
After 51 chapters of sweeping prophecies, collapsing empires, and terrifying judgments, the book concludes with a tiny, highly specific, incredibly emotional glimmer of light in the absolute dark.
Yes. It zooms in from the macro scale of falling empires to the micro scale of one single human life. It tells the story of King Jehoiachin.
Okay, tell us about him.
Now, Jehoiachin was the king of Judah who was taken captive to Babylon years before Zedekiah. By the time we reach this final paragraph, Jehoiachin has been rotting in a dark Babylonian dungeon for 37 years.
37 years.
Just try to grasp that. 37 years in the dark, wearing prison rags, stripped of his dignity, a forgotten footnote in the belly of the beast. But then a new king, unexpectedly, comes to power in Babylon, a man named Evil Merodach.
Despite the unfortunate name.
Right, despite the name. And inexplicably, for reasons entirely unprompted by geopolitical strategy, he releases Jehoiachin from prison. He takes off his filthy prison garments. He gives him fresh clothes. He speaks kindly to him.
Wow.
And he gives this broken, forgotten exile a permanent seat at the king's own table. And the text notes that Jehoiachin eats there, receiving a daily allowance for the rest of his natural life.
After 37 years, you have to imagine the crushing despair he must have lived with for nearly 4 decades. He must have concluded that his life was entirely, irrevocably over.
He must have felt totally abandoned.
He must have believed that God had completely forgotten him, that the darkness had won. And then on a random Tuesday, a door swings open, the chains come off, and he is seated at a banquet table.
The classic commentators offer a deeply moving reflection on this exact historical moment. They use a wonderful phrase, noting, "Such checkerwork is this world. While there is life, there is hope."
Checkerwork, I love that.
It is a profound reminder that human history, and indeed our own individual lives, are never a monochromatic block of despair. Life is a checkerwork, an intricate, unpredictable mix of profound light and devastating dark, of crushing tragedy and sudden, unmerited triumph.
It's never just one thing.
The sudden, gracious release of Jehoiachin is not just a nice historical footnote. It is a vital, blazing signal flare sent to all the exiles reading the scroll. It tells them that the story is absolutely not over. The long, suffocating night of captivity will eventually break into dawn. The God who remembers the forgotten king rotting in the dungeon will surely remember the people weeping in exile.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, what does this massive, sweeping journey mean for us? If we distill 52 chapters of ancient history, prophecies, and human tragedy into clarity for the present moment, empires fall.
They all fall.
The systems that seem completely invincible, whether it is the swift external military might of Egypt, the comfortable, untested stagnation of Moab, the geographical and intellectual arrogance of Edom, or the massive, imposing, world-dominating walls of Babylon, they all eventually and inevitably crumble into dust.
That's the undeniable pattern.
Human pride is a fatal trap. The text proves that finding our core security in accumulated wealth, military power, or our own intellect is a complete illusion. Justice, though it may seem agonizingly delayed in the moment, is structurally inevitable. The moral arc of the universe does, in fact, bend toward ultimate accountability.
It demands an accounting.
But the final enduring note of the book of Jeremiah is grace. No matter how deep the judgment has cut, and no matter how long you feel you have been sitting in the dark, even if it's been 37 years of failure, pain, or captivity, just like Jehoiachin, restoration is always possible. The door can swing open. There is always a way back to Zion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the ongoing challenge for every single one of us is to live our daily lives with that profound awareness. We are challenged not to be hypnotized and intoxicated by the golden cups of our own modern Babylons, but to keep our faces steadfastly turned toward what is actually true, what is enduringly lasting, and what is fundamentally just.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. Think back to that incredible scene with the scroll sitting at the bottom of the Euphrates River, weighed down by a heavy stone.
Oh, yeah.
For years, maybe decades, the citizens of Babylon marched over the bridges of that river, completely unaware of what lay beneath the current. They went about their daily business, building their immense wealth, expanding their military empire, fully and arrogantly believing in their own eternal invincibility.
They had no idea.
Yet their fate was already written. The absolute decree of their downfall was resting silently at the bottom of their own life-giving river, just waiting for the appointed time to arrive. It makes you wonder, what truths are resting silently beneath the surface of our own modern empires? What decrees are waiting at the bottom of our own carefully constructed, comfortable lives, just waiting for their appointed time to rise? That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.